The scent of stale lilies and lingering grief hung thick in the air of the house that was supposed to be my home. My father, Richard, had been gone for 3 days. My stepbrother, Ethan, stood in the living room, surrounded by our remaining exhausted relatives, his face a mask of strained composure that failed to hide the triumphant greed in his eyes. Ethan was technically 20 years older than me and had always viewed my mother, Sarah, and me as intruders, necessary evils tolerated only by my father's insistence. The funeral reception was barely over when Ethan decided to execute his master plan. He waited until the last neighbor had left, and the silence of the large, beautiful house settled around us. He turned to my mother, then to me, Jessica. I was only 20, halfway through college, and still reeling from the sudden loss of the man who had loved me like his own.
"Get out," Ethan said, his voice cold and flat, void of any warmth, any empathy. "I want you both out of here by the end of the week." My mother, Sarah, stumbled backward, leaning against the doorway for support. "Ethan, please. Where are we supposed to go?"
"Your father would never." "My father is gone, Sarah." He cut her off, his eyes hard and venomous. "And this house, legally, is mine.
The trust I set up years ago ensures that. You are a drain on the estate, and you will never be my family." He emphasized the last word, spitting it out like poison. "I'm selling this place. I want zero trace of your gold-digging presence in my life. Get your things and leave." The shock was total. My life, built entirely under the protective umbrella of my father's love and his home, was instantly dismantled. Ethan, the older, aggressive son from a previous marriage, had always been a bully. Now he was a conqueror, and we were the spoils of war. I'm Jessica. I grew up believing that family was built on love, not blood. When my stepbrother kicked my grieving mother and me out onto the street, I found out just how fragile that belief was. Now you're hearing the story of how my late father delivered the ultimate verdict on that betrayal. Before we get into the details of the reading of the will, tell me where you are listening to this story from. It helps me remember that even in the darkest moments, there's always a connection out there. We had no choice but to leave. We packed a few bags, watched by Ethan's relentless smug gaze. We drove away from the house, the only home I had ever known, in my mother's battered car. We ended up in a cheap, temporary extended-stay hotel miles away, living out of suitcases, heartbroken and financially terrified. Ethan had left us with almost no liquid cash, claiming my father's accounts were frozen by the estate. He knew we were vulnerable, and he was taking advantage of the chaos of grief. This was the setup: the eviction, the betrayal, and the profound injustice. The escalation began almost immediately with the discovery of the lawyer. Ethan had retained the most prestigious, expensive estate lawyer in the state, a man named Mr. State Harrington, known for ruthlessly protecting high-net-worth clients. Ethan made sure to rub it in, texting my mother a picture of the firm's gleaming skyscraper, gloating about the legal wall he had erected. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday. My mother and I sat in a borrowed car outside Mr. Fisterminster Harrington's opulent office building, feeling miserably out of place.
Ethan arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a custom suit, radiating the full, toxic confidence of a man who believed the world owed him everything. He gave us a condescending nod before disappearing into the elevator. When we were finally ushered into the conference room, the air was thick with the scent of leather and old money. Mr. Sec never do this. Harrington, a stern, silver-haired man, sat at the head of the table. Ethan sat across from us, tapping a Mont Blanc pen on the polished wood. He didn't even acknowledge our presence. He was there for the coronation. Mr. Harrington started with the preliminary clauses, detailing the distribution of minor personal effects, antique watches, paintings, etc. Ethan leaned back, smiling faintly. Then came the reading of the major asset distribution. Mr. Harrington began reading a long, complex clause about a newly formed trust.
The late Mr. Richard Hayes, the lawyer read in a monotone, established an irrevocable, shielded trust known as the Athena Fund, specifically created outside the existing family trust and designated for the distribution of his intellectual property and his controlling shares in Hayes Advanced Technologies. Ethan stopped tapping his pen. Hayes Advanced Technologies. That was the core of my father's immense wealth, the biomedical engineering firm he had co-founded, now valued in the hundreds of millions. Ethan had always assumed those shares were part of the general family estate, which he felt he had absolute control over. Mr. Dale was a bearer jasamited forever. Harrington continued, the sole beneficiary of the Athena Fund and the controlling shares of Hayes Advanced Technologies is my beloved daughter, Jessica Hayes. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush mountains. My mother gasped, a sound quickly stifled by her own shock. I felt a weird lightness in my head, like the pressure had suddenly dropped. Ethan's smile vanished. His face went white. He opened his mouth but no sound came out. Mr. Harrington, however, kept reading. He was reading from a separate document, a holographic codicil, entirely handwritten by my father. Furthermore, Mr. Harrington continued, his voice now betraying a flicker of professional surprise, entirely had been reading Mrs. Hologofildens in the holographic codicil, entirely had been reading Desteas Fraz. Furthermore, Mr. Herring Mostaferi. The entirety of the remaining liquid estate, including all personal residences, vehicles, and bank accounts, is placed into a secondary trust, the Shelter Trust, to be managed by the executor until such time that the primary beneficiary of the Athena Fund attains the age of 25 or graduates from her accredited university. Ethan finally found his voice, a strangled, panicked sound. The residences? The house?
That's impossible. I have the deed in my name. The family trust? Mr. Harrington calmly laid down the codicil. He looked straight at Ethan, his professional neutrality finally cracking. Hayes, your father did two things very deliberately in the last year of his life. First, he created a highly specific legal instrument, a right of first refusal clause, tied to a promissory note on the primary residence that you acquired from him, should you attempt to sell, mortgage, or transfer that property before the reading of his will. That clause immediately activates. Your father, legally, has first right to repurchase the property for the original sale price, $1. As he is deceased, that right transfers to his executor, with the ultimate beneficiary being the Shelter Trust. Ethan's jaw dropped. He had evicted us, assuming his control of the house was absolute.
They had been planning to sell it this coming Monday. The lawyer leaned forward slightly, delivering the final, devastating sentence of the codicil. Finally, my father's will explicitly states, due to his demonstrated contempt and lack of familial charity, I explicitly disinherit my stepson, Ethan Hayes, from all current and future claims upon my estate. Ethan's face was frozen in a mask of total, catastrophic disbelief. Mr. Frozen in a mask of total, catastrophic disbelief. Mr. Frozen in a mask of total of the way. Mr. Frozen a mask of total of foundations of then. Ethan Harriet makes A.S. Harrington, the silver-haired corporate lawyer, looked down at the documents in his hand, and then back at Ethan. The lawyer's jaw dropped. He couldn't hide his astonishment at the depth of my father's strategic foresight and his ruthless execution. My father had predicted Ethan's greed and preemptively nullified his actions, delivering the ultimate verdict on his relationship with his son. Ethan didn't just panic, he erupted.
The conference room meeting descended into chaos. He knocked his chair backward, shouting incoherent accusations at Mr. Champel. Harrington and my father's memory. You bastard. You old fool. You couldn't trust me. I'm your son. I'm the one who managed your accounts. Harrington remained unnervingly calm, gesturing to a large, silent security guard who had positioned himself by the door. Hayes, I suggest you consult with your own counsel. The will is legally sound, and the trusts are irrevocable. The controlling shares of Hayes Advanced Technologies, as of this morning, are entirely vested in your stepsister Jessica. The Athena Fund is valued conservatively at $350 million. $350 million. The figure hung in the air like a thunderclap. My mother silently grabbed my hand, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of dizzying relief.
Ethan's rage instantly curdled into pure, desperate terror. He hadn't just lost the house. He had lost the massive, unimaginable future he believed was his birthright. The house was merely the microhook, the small thing he thought he could grab easily, that exposed the massive, multi-million-dollar fraud of his expectation. I didn't say a word. I simply watched him, a quiet, surreal sense of justice washing over me. He had called me a gold digger. He had called my mother a drain. He had kicked us out in our moment of deepest grief. My father's final act was the ultimate defense of his chosen family. This was the climax, the revelation that turned the eviction into the ultimate boomerang of betrayal. We left the office with Mr. Harrington, leaving Ethan screaming threats and curses at the deserted table.
Mr. Harrington, now deferential and respectful, explained the full genius of my father's planning. Your father, Jessica, was a genius in business, and even more so in anticipating human behavior, Mr. Harrington explained. He knew Ethan would try to assert control immediately. The deed transfer to Ethan was a calculated ruse, a trap. Your father retained the crucial control mechanism through that obscure promissory note, knowing Ethan's first impulse would be to sell or leverage the house, triggering the recapture clause. The poetic justice unfolded over the next few weeks with brutal efficiency. First, the house. Because Ethan had attempted to sell the house, even calling a realtor, and signing initial paperwork, the recapture clause was activated. The shelter trust, managed by Mr. Toole. Harrington legally repurchased the property for the sum of $1.
Ethan, who had spent the last 2 years running up massive debts against the assumption of his massive inheritance, was suddenly left with a mountain of legal bills, a house that wasn't his, and zero capital. Second, the career. Ethan worked as an independent consultant, relying entirely on his wealthy background and family connections for credibility. When the news of the will and the embarrassing details of his disinheritance, specifically citing his lack of familial charity, leaked into the legal community, his reputation was annihilated. He was no longer the successful heir. He was the greedy stepson who had been outsmarted and publicly shamed by his father's final, devastating legal maneuver. His career collapsed. My mother and I, meanwhile, moved back into the house.
Mr. Harrington arranged for a large, comfortable apartment near my university for the interim, ensuring my academic life wasn't disrupted. I didn't need to work. I had $350 million backing my future. 2 months later, I was walking across campus when my mother called. She sounded shaken. Jessica, I just saw Ethan. He hadn't been in a custom suit. He was working as a cashier at a struggling local convenience store. His creditors had foreclosed on his investment properties, and he was living in a small, rented room above the laundromat. His arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. The final act of the drama occurred a few days after that. Mr. Harrington needed me to sign off on the final official transfer documents for the house.
As I sat in the conference room, the same room where Ethan had been crushed, Mr. Harrington handed me a sealed envelope, separate from the legal files. Your father asked me to give you this. When you return to the house, Jessica, he said softly. Inside was a small, worn key and a handwritten note from my father. My dearest Jessica, I always knew who was family, and I always knew who was a pretender. The greatest wealth is independence. Use this key to open the locked drawer in the library desk. Everything you need to finish college, and everything you need to start your new life, is there. I love you, my daughter. Never let anyone define your worth. The key was for the one drawer Ethan had never been able to open, the one he thought contained old tax receipts. I didn't open it immediately. I didn't need to. My father had already given me everything.
He had protected my mother, secured my future, and delivered the ultimate, quiet revenge on the man who had tried to destroy us. The arrogant stepbrother who believed his bloodline granted him dominance ended up with nothing. The drain on the estate inherited $250 million and the house. And that's when I realized that my father's love was far more ruthless and enduring than Ethan's greed.